twins with extreme deformities. What are the biological consequences when siblings marry each other? One of the most disturbing chapters in human history remains the biological consequences of consanguineous unions, especially when they occur over multiple generations. In the state of West Virginia, in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, a community existed that time forgot. The year was 1937. Still struggling to recover from the Great Depression was the country. And while major cities were beginning to see signs of economic recovery, the isolated valleys and steep slopes of the Appalachians remained a world apart, a place where families lived following traditions that dated back generations. One such lineage was the Blackwood family. Established in that region since the late 18th century when the first European settlers ventured through the Appalachian, the Blackwoods were known for their self-imposed isolation. As decades passed, the Blackwoods remained while other families migrated to cities in search of opportunities, transforming into a genetic island amid the mountains. The Blackwood clan was always viewed with suspicion by residents of nearby towns, reports Dr. Thomas Harrison, a historian at the University of West Virginia who dedicated decades to studying isolated communities in the region. They rarely came down from the mountain except to trade furs and crafts for essential supplies. A common practice became marriages within the family, not by conscious choice, but by geographical and social inevitability. A closed world was the Blackwood property. The only access was a winding, treacherous dirt road, making visits rare, especially during the harsh mountain winters. The main house, a two-story wooden structure built by the original patriarch Isaiah Blackwood, had been expanded over the years to accommodate the growing family. Around it, small cabins housed the various branches of the family, creating a small family settlement. First cousins Sarah and Joseph Blackwood married in 1915. Like so many other family members before them, they saw nothing wrong with this union. For them, it was simply the continuation of a family pattern. The couple's first children were born without apparent problems, although some showed less than average height and slight learning difficulties. It was in 1929, at the beginning of the Great Depression, that Sarah gave birth to twins, Elelina and Edward. From birth, it was evident that something was wrong. The local doctor, who rarely visited the community, was urgently called. What he witnessed left him deeply disturbed, as recorded in his medical diary discovered decades later. In newborns, I have never witnessed such deformities. Severely malfunctioning cranial structures with disproportionately large heads are presented by the children. Underdeveloped are the upper limbs and both appear incapable of normal sucking. I fear they will not survive more than a few days. I strongly suspect the cause is the consanguineous union of the parents added to previous generations of marriages between close relatives. Contrary to all medical expectations, Eleanor and Edward survived. In the following years, they showed severe developmental delays, failing to achieve basic milestones such as sitting, crawling, or speaking. Their heads continued to grow abnormally, while their bodies remained fragile and underdeveloped. The condition of the Blackwood twins was probably a severe form of hydrocephalus combined with other genetic anomalies resulting from prolonged consanguinity, explains Dr. Melissa Carter, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins University. When close relatives have children, it drastically increases the probability of harmful recessive genes manifesting. In the case of multiple generations of consanguineous marriages, these effects can become devastating. A turning point for the Blackwood family was marked by the birth of the twins. Sarah fell into a deep depression, unable to accept her children's condition. Joseph, in turn, retreated further into isolation, forbidding any contact between the family and the outside world. It was in this context of extreme isolation that something occurred that would forever change the fate of the Blackwood family. Something so disturbing that it remained a whispered secret for decades in neighboring communities. The twins, now 8 years old in 1937, required constant care. Unable to walk or communicate, they were entirely dependent on their relatives. Growing tension in the family was created by the situation, especially between Sarah and Joseph. Discussions became increasingly frequent and intense. On a particularly cold January night, while a snowstorm further isolated the property, a discussion between the couple escalated to unprecedented levels. Through the main house, screams echoed, waking other family members. "This isn't natural. Look at them. "Look what we've done," Sarah was heard shouting, according to later reports from one of the couple's nephews. The next morning, when the storm finally subsided, a scene of horror awaited the family. Sarah had disappeared along with the twins. Only tracks in the freshly fallen snow led to the edge of a nearby cliff. What happened that night remains one of the darkest episodes in the history of the Blackwood family and a tragic testimony to the devastating consequences that decades of consanguineous marriages can produce. Make sure you're already subscribed to this channel. Here is being revealed the truth about isolated family lineages in rural America, with historical and scientific details you won't find anywhere else. Essential for us to continue investigating these cases that history tried to forget is your subscription. The story of the Blackwood family neither began nor ended with the tragedy of Sarah and her twin children. To fully understand what led to that fateful winter night in 1937, we need to go back even further in time and examine how this pattern of isolation and consanguinity formed. In 1792, Patriarch Isaiah Blackwood arrived in the Appalachian Mountains, fleeing accusations of heterodox practices in New England. A taciturn and suspicious man, Isaiah believed the outside world was corrupt, and that only in isolation could his family preserve what he called spiritual and physical purity. Isaiah Blackwood was a classic example of a leader who used isolation as a tool of control, explains Dr. Rebecca Johnson, an anthropologist specializing in closed communities. Historical archives suggest he had already been expelled from 3 different communities before finding refuge in the mountains, always for imposing extreme views on family segregation. In his personal notes, discovered in a hidden chest in the main house only in the 1970s, Isaiah wrote, "Our lineages must remain pure without mixing with outsiders. The strength of our blood depends on it." This distorted view was passed on to subsequent generations as an unquestionable dogma. By the 3rd generation, the Blackwoods rarely married people from outside the family. The norm became marriages between cousins, and occasionally even closer unions occurred. Gradually, problems began to appear. In the 1850s, local documents mentioned that Blackwood children exhibited worrying peculiarities, including smaller statures, vision problems, and cognitive difficulties. But the family attributed these problems to curses or divine trials, never questioning their matrimonial practices. What we're seeing here is a classic example of how isolation can lead to genetically dangerous practices, states Dr. Howard Miller, a geneticist at Princeton University. The effects of consanguinity are cumulative. A single generation of union between cousins may have minimal effects. But when this is repeated over 5, 6, or 7 generations, the risk of serious genetic anomalies increases exponentially. Returning to Joseph and Sarah Blackwood, first cousins and direct descendants of 6 generations of consanguineous marriages, the stage was set for a genetic catastrophe. When Sarah became pregnant for the 3rd time in 1928, she had already given birth to 2 children who showed mild signs of the effects of consanguinity: Michael, who had 6 fingers on each hand, and Ruth, who presented learning difficulties. Exceptionally difficult was the twins' pregnancy. Throughout the gestational period, Sarah suffered from severe nausea and gained very little weight. The delivery, which occurred during a snowstorm that prevented the doctor's arrival, was assisted only by older women in the family. Eleanor was born first, followed by Edward 20 minutes later. The shock was immediate. Besides disproportionately large heads, the babies presented multiple deformities. Their eyes were widely spaced, their lips had fissures, and their hands had fused fingers. Even more disturbing was the fact that the twins seemed to mirror each other. Eleanor had more pronounced deformities on the right side of her body, while Edward presented them on the left side. This is a phenomenon known as genetic complementarity, particularly concerning in twins born from consanguineous unions, explains Dr. Carter. It's as if the compromised genetic material was distributed between the 2 fetuses, creating mirrored patterns of malformations. It's extremely rare, but well documented in medical literature, especially in genetically isolated populations. As the twins grew, their conditions became more challenging. At 3 years old, they still couldn't sit without support. At 5, they hadn't developed comprehensible speech, although they seemed to understand simple commands. Most disturbing was the extraordinary bond between them. When separated, even if only by a wall, they became extremely agitated, emitting distressing screams until they were reunited. This type of connection between monozygotic twins is already common in healthy pairs. But in cases of compromised neurological development, it can manifest in even more intense ways, observes Dr. William Tennant, a pediatric neurologist who studied the few medical records of the Blackwood twins decades later. Reports suggest that Elelonina and Edward possibly shared a type of nonverbal communication that other family members did not understand. Gradually, the twins' condition deteriorated. At 7 years old, Edward began having frequent seizures. Elelonina developed severe scoliosis that further hindered her already limited mobility. The burden of caring for them fell primarily on Sarah as Joseph spent increasingly more time away working in the family fields or hunting in the mountains. A distant cousin, Daniel Blackwood, who occasionally visited the property to bring supplies, left a disturbing account in his personal diary, dated November 1936, "I visited Joseph and Sarah today. The situation worsens each time I come. The children are larger, more difficult to carry, but equally dependent. Sarah looks like a ghost of herself. Her eyes are sunken, empty. When I tried to talk about taking the twins to a specialist in Charleston, Joseph exploded with anger. No outsider will lay hands on my children," he shouted. "I fear for what might happen in that house." The closest neighbors, the Patterson family, who lived about 5 kilometers away, reported hearing screams coming from the Blackwood property with increasing frequency in the winter of 1936-37. On one occasion, Martha Patterson found Sarah wandering alone in the forest, talking to herself incoherently. She was repeating something about cleansing the blood and ending the suffering, Martha later reported. "I tried to take her home, but she refused my help. I should have insisted more. Perhaps I could have prevented what happened afterward." One of the most severe winters ever recorded in the Appalachian Mountains was the fateful winter of 1937. Successive snowstorms further isolated the already reclusive Blackwood family. It was in this context of extreme isolation, unbearable psychological pressure, and without any external support that disaster became inevitable. The morning after Sarah and the twins disappeared dawned clear and cold. The snow had stopped, leaving a white immaculate layer covering the Blackwood property. It was Joseph's younger brother, Thomas, who first noticed the tracks in the snow leading from the main house toward the cliff known as Devil's Leap, a precipice with more than 80 m of free fall to the rocky river below. "Something's wrong," Thomas said upon finding his brother in the kitchen. "Sarah and the children aren't in the house, and there are footprints going to the cliff." What followed was a frantic search. Joseph, Thomas, and 2 cousins followed the tracks in the snow. They were clearly visible, it wasn't difficult to follow them. A set of adult footprints accompanied by drag marks indicated that Sarah had carried or dragged the incapacitated twins. The tracks ended abruptly at the edge of the cliff. There were no signs of struggle, just an area where the snow had been compacted, as if someone had remained there for some time. "She stood here," Joseph murmured, "kneeling in the snow. She stood here looking down." The search for the bodies began immediately, but conditions were almost impossible. The river was partially frozen, its banks covered with snow, and the steep terrain made descent extremely dangerous. It was only 3 days later that they found the first body, little Edward, trapped between rocks about half a kilometer downstream. His body was remarkably preserved by the cold, his eyes open, staring at the grey winter sky. Elelonina's body was found the next day further away, almost entirely covered by snow on the river banks. Sarah remained missing for another 2 weeks. When they finally found her, it was a shock to everyone. Her body wasn't in the river or on its banks, but in a small cave on the face of the cliff about 20 m below the top. Somehow, she had survived the initial fall, dragging herself to the shelter of the cave, where she finally succumbed, probably due to a combination of injuries and exposure to extreme cold. Most disturbing was what they found with her, a diary protected in a waterproof bag containing her last words. The pages were stained with blood and tears, but the text was still legible. "May God forgive me for what I've done. I could no longer bear to see my angel suffering. Each day it got worse. Edward had 3 seizures yesterday. Elelonina won't stop crying. I know it's our fault. The blood is cursed. Generations of sin have brought us here. I tried to love my children the best way I could, but love is not enough against what we've done. Now I understand what my grandmother tried to tell me before I married Joseph. The blood needs new life, she said. But I didn't listen. No one listened. And now my babies pay the price. There is no hope for them in this world. I can only pray they find peace in the next. May God have mercy on our souls. Local authorities investigated the case, but in isolated communities like that one in the late 1930s, such family tragedies rarely received more than a superficial investigation. The official verdict was accidental death, although everyone involved knew it was a clear case of maternal despair that culminated in an unimaginable tragedy. Joseph Blackwood never recovered from the loss. In the following months, he became even more reclusive, often sleeping in the empty room that had belonged to the twins. Neighbors reported hearing him talking as if the children were still there. The story of the Blackwood family represents one of the most extreme examples of the impact of prolonged consanguinity, states Dr. Miller. What makes this case particularly tragic is that unlike some isolated communities that practice consanguineous marriages for specific cultural or religious reasons, the Blackwoods seem to have been victims of geographical isolation and their founders' paranoia, leading to generations of practices that resulted in devastating consequences. If you're feeling your heart tighten with this story, you're not alone. Leave in the comments, "The blood needs new life." This phrase from Sarah's grandmother carries a powerful scientific truth that many isolated communities discovered too late. Your comment helps keep this important discussion about the risks of consanguinity alive. The case of the Blackwood twins might have remained just a tragic local episode if not for the arrival of someone who would forever change the understanding of what was happening in that isolated community. In September 1937, just 8 months after the tragedy, a young doctor named Dr. Robert Carlson arrived in the small town of Millerville, the closest to the Blackwood property. Freshly graduated from Johns Hopkins University, Carlson had chosen to work in a rural area as part of a federal program created during the New Deal to bring medical assistance to remote regions. Curious and idealistic, Dr. Carlson soon began to hear rumors about the Mountain family and their strange children. At first, he attributed such stories to local superstition, but when treating a member of the Patterson family for pneumonia, he heard first-hand accounts about the Blackwoods and the recent tragedy involving Sarah and the twins. As a doctor, I cannot ignore what appears to be a clear case of severe genetic problems, he wrote in his professional diary. If what they say about generations of marriages between close relatives is true, this family represents a significant scientific case study, as well as a human tragedy that could possibly have been avoided with proper medical intervention. Dr. Carlson didn't know that his arrival in the region would mark the beginning of one of the most comprehensive studies on consanguinity ever conducted in the United States. With patience and persistence, he began to build a relationship with the more accessible members of the Blackwood family, mainly with Thomas, Joseph's brother, who occasionally came to town for shopping. His efforts to gain the Blackwoods' trust were extraordinary, comments Dr. Elizabeth Winters, a medical historian at Columbia University. At a time when the distance between medical professionals and rural communities was enormous, Carlson demonstrated remarkable sensitivity, gradually approaching and offering help without judgment. Dr. Carlson's records, later published in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 1952, with names changed to protect the family's privacy, reveal the slow process of discovering the extent of the problem. Initially, he obtained permission only to examine some of the family's children, supposedly for a free checkup. What he found deeply alarmed him. Of the 17 children he initially examined, 14 presented some type of physical or cognitive anomaly: fused fingers, synendacty, underdeveloped jaws, micrognathia, severe strabismus, partial or total deafness, and various degrees of intellectual impairment. Almost all presented height significantly below average for their ages. The pattern is consistent with multiple generations of inbreeding, he wrote in his notes. The problems observed are clearly the result of the expression of harmful recessive genes that in a genetically diverse population would remain dormant. The concentration of these genes through successive consanguineous marriages has created a high-risk situation for each new child born into the family. Over time, and especially after gaining Thomas Blackwood's trust, Dr. Carlson gained access to the complete family history with the help of parish records, birth certificates, and oral accounts. He reconstructed the Blackwoods family tree, documenting 7 generations of consanguineous marriages, including several unions between first cousins and at least 2 cases of marriages between uncle and niece. What Carlson documented was essentially an involuntary experiment in human genetics, explains Dr. Miller. In isolated populations like the Blackwoods, where marriages between close relatives occur for generations, the frequency of recessive genetic diseases can increase drastically. Normally, these deleterious genes remain hidden because a person needs to inherit 2 copies of the gene, one from each parent to manifest the condition. When both parents share recent ancestors, the probability of carrying the same harmful recessive genes increases significantly. The extreme point of this phenomenon was represented by the case of the twins Elena and Edward. Based on available descriptions and the few existing medical records, modern specialists believe they probably suffered from a rare combination of congenital hydrophilis, craniosynosis, premature closure of cranial sutures, and multiple other malformations resulting from the expression of deleterious recessive genes. The most tragic aspect of this story is that it wasn't a biological inevitability, but the direct result of social practices that could have been avoided, states Dr. Johnson. Geographical isolation was aggravated by self-imposed isolation, transforming a circumstantial tendency into a devastating family dogma. Joseph Blackwood, still devastated by the loss of his wife and children, initially refused to speak with Dr. Carlson. It was only in 1939, almost 2 years after the tragedy, that he finally agreed to talk. The account of this meeting, preserved in Carlson's notes, is moving. I met JB today at his home. The man seems to have aged 20 years in just 2, completely grey hair, hunched posture, distant gaze. The house is in a state of abandonment. When I mentioned the reason for my visit, to discuss the risks of marriages between close relatives, he initially shut down. After some time in silence, he began to talk about the twins. They had eyes just like mine, he said, even though he couldn't speak properly. Edward laughed just like my father. Can you imagine that, doctor, seeing your own father in the eyes of a child who can barely lift his head? And Elena, she held my finger with such strength, so small, but with such strength. When I asked if he knew that marriage between cousins could cause problems in children, he replied, my parents were cousins. Their parents too. Everyone seemed normal. How could I have known? This is the fundamental tragedy, ignorance passing from generation to generation combined with isolation and distrust of the outside world. When I tried to explain the basic principles of heredity, he interrupted me. It's too late for me now, doctor, but maybe not for the others. Talk to my brother. Talk to the young ones. And that's exactly what Dr. Carlson did. In the following years, he worked tirelessly with the younger members of the Blackwood family, educating them about the risks of consanguinity and helping to establish connections with neighboring communities. His work wasn't limited to the Blackwoods. He identified several other isolated families in the Appalachian Mountains with similar, though less extreme, patterns of consanguineous marriages. The 1940s brought significant changes to the region. World War II and subsequent industrialization led many young people from the mountains to the cities. The construction of better roads reduced geographical isolation. Electricity reached previously isolated areas. And perhaps most importantly, medical knowledge became more accessible for the Blackwoods. The change was gradual but significant. Thomas, Joseph's brother, became a vocal advocate against marriages between relatives, openly sharing his family's tragic history as a warning. Several young Blackwoods married people from outside the family, introducing the necessary genetic diversity to the lineage. Joseph Blackwood never fully recovered. He lived as a recluse until his death in 1952 at the age of 64. In his final years, he allowed Dr. Carlson to document the complete family history on the condition that real names would be changed in any publication. Joseph understood, too late for his own family, that their story could save others. Carlson wrote, in our last meeting, he told me, tell the truth, doctor. Tell it so that no one else goes through what we went through. Far beyond the personal tragedy that befell them extends the legacy of the Blackwood family. The study conducted by Dr. Carlson, published under the titles Effects of Prolonged Consanguinity in Isolated Appalachian Populations, became a reference in the medical literature on population genetics. Although the exact names and locations were altered to protect the family's privacy, the compiled data offered valuable insights into the mechanisms of heredity and the specific risks associated with recurrent consanguineous marriages. Carlson's work was pioneering, states Dr. James Wilson, professor of medical genetics at Harvard University. In an era before human genome mapping, when our understanding of genetics was still rudimentary, he managed to document inheritance patterns and clearly demonstrate how certain conditions manifested with increased frequency in lineages with a high degree of consanguinity. The data collected by Dr. Carlson showed that in the Blackwood family, the incidence of congenital anomalies was approximately 17 times higher than in the general population. The most common conditions included polydactyly, extra fingers present in 23% of children. Syndactyly, fused fingers present in 18% of children. Microcephaly, abnormally small head 12%. Hydrophilus, fluid accumulation in the brain 7%. Intellectual disability of various degrees, approximately 45%. Congenital deafness, 19%. Cardiac malformations, 14%. What makes Carlson's study so valuable is that he managed to follow the family for more than a decade, documenting how the introduction of new genes through marriages with unrelated people began to reduce the incidence of these conditions in subsequent generations, explains Dr. Carter. Indeed, in the generation born between 1940 and 1955, after the beginning of Carlson's efforts to educate the family, the incidence of congenital anomalies dropped dramatically. Of the 28 children born during this period, only 6 presented any of the conditions previously common in the family, and even these were of a milder nature. Eventually, the Blackwood story transcended the purely medical realm, becoming a case study also for anthropologists, sociologists, and historians interested in the dynamics of isolated communities and the impact of cultural beliefs on marital practices. What happened to the Blackwoods wasn't simply the result of individual decisions, but of a complex interweaving of geographical isolation, specific cultural beliefs, and lack of access to scientific information, observes Dr. Johnson. This makes us question how many other isolated communities around the world may be facing similar problems even today. Indeed, modern studies have identified several populations around the world where consanguineous marriages remain common, often due to cultural traditions or geographical isolation. In some communities, the rate of marriages between first cousins can reach 20 to 50% of all matrimonial unions. Modern science allows us to understand the specific risks and quantify them with precision, explains Dr. Wilson. We now know that an isolated marriage between first cousins increases the risk of congenital anomalies by approximately 4 to 7% above the population baseline. This risk, although significant, is manageable with adequate genetic counseling. The real danger arises when these marriages occur repeatedly over multiple generations, as in the case of the Blackwoods. The fate of the Blackwood property reflects the changes that occurred in the family. The main house, where Joseph lived his last years in seclusion, was abandoned after his death and eventually succumbed to the elements. The lands were divided among the descendants, many of whom chose to sell their portions and move to urban areas. In 1972, Thomas Blackwood Jr., Joseph's nephew and one of the first family members to obtain a university education, established the Blackwood Foundation for Genetic Studies. Using resources obtained from selling part of the family lands, the foundation funds research on rare genetic diseases and offers free genetic counseling for families in isolated rural areas. It's our way of transforming the family tragedy into something positive, declared Thomas Jr. in a 1975 interview. If the knowledge that emerged from our family's suffering can prevent others from going through the same, then something good will have come from all this. The twins, Eleanor and Edward Blackwood, whose brief and difficult lives catalyzed such significant changes, were buried in a small family cemetery on the property. For decades, their graves remained marked only by simple stones. In 1997, on the 60th anniversary of their deaths, the family descendants erected a granite monument with the inscription, Eleanor and Edward Blackwood, 1929 to 1937. Their brief lives brought light to what was in the shadows. May their legacy be knowledge and understanding. Dr. Robert Carlson continued his work in the Appalachian Mountains until his retirement in 1965. his study of the Blackwoods and other similar families led to the creation of specific educational programs for isolated communities, addressing not only issues of consanguinity but also other common health problems in these populations. In 1983, a documentary produced by PBS titled Isolated Lineages, The Genetics of the Mountains presented an anonymous version of the Blackwood story, bringing national attention to health issues in isolated communities. The program, which won an Emmy, was credited with stimulating significant improvements in rural health services. The Blackwood story, although deeply tragic, also represents a powerful example of how scientific knowledge can transform destinies, concludes Dr. Winters. What began as a narrative of ignorance and isolation transformed into a catalyst for education and change. It's a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, there is potential for learning and growth. Today, the descendants of the Blackwoods are scattered throughout the country, many of them without fully knowing their family history. Those who do know carry with them not only the memory of the tragedy but also the pride of how their family eventually embraced knowledge and worked to transform their legacy. As Dr. Carlson observed in his final notes, human history is full of examples of how ignorance can lead to suffering, but equally abundant are examples of how knowledge can redeem even the darkest chapters of our lives. The Blackwoods exemplify both. If you watched until here, it's because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here, so I can get to know you and know who really enjoys the stories on this channel." Don't forget to leave your like and share this video with people who might be interested in these hidden stories of American society. Your subscription is fundamental for us to continue revealing these cases that history tried to forget. Science and history have much to teach us about the consequences of practices such as consanguinity, and it is our duty to bring these lessons to light.